Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Chapter 24, Dominique Catherine de Pérignon, Marshal.
Among the few men of moderate opinion who were chosen in 1791 to represent their country in the Legislative Assembly was Dominique Catherine de Pérignon. The scion of a good family of Grenade in the Upper Garonne, neither an ultra-royalist nor ultra-republican, he was a man of action rather than a talker. 1 year spent among the self-seekers of Paris was sufficient to prove to him that his role did not lie among the twisting paths of partisan statesmanship, and gladly, in 1792, he heard the summons to arms and left the forum for the camp. Now 38 years old, having been born on May 31st, 1754, this was not his first experience of soldiering. He had held a commission for some years in the old Royal Army and had served on the staff. He was, for this reason, at once elected Lieutenant Colonel of the Volunteer Legion of the Pyrenees. His bravery and his former military training soon caused him to rise among the mass of ignorant and untrained volunteers who formed the Army of the Pyrenees. Luckily for France, she was opposed on her western frontier by an army which knew as little of war as her own, led by officers of equal ignorance. Without the stimulus of burning enthusiasm and the dread power of the guillotine. Had it been otherwise, Perpignan and the fortresses covering Provence would soon have been in the hands of the enemy. With all Europe threatening the eastern frontier and civil war at home, the government could spare but few troops, and these the least trained, for the defense of the West. Accordingly, in the opening fights of the campaign, ill-conceived plans and panics too frequently caused the defeat of the French, and it was often only the personal example of individuals which saved the army from absolute annihilation. From the first engagement, Pérignon made his mark by his coolness and courage. The French attack on the Spanish position at Serres had been brought to a halt by the fierce fire of the enemy, and as the line wavered, a timely charge of the Spanish horse threw it into confusion. Pérignon, commanding the first line, rushed up and seized the musket and cartridges of a wounded soldier, and collecting a few undaunted privates, quietly opened fire on the Spanish cavalry, and by his example shamed the runaways into returning to the attack. For this he was created General of Brigade on July 28, 1793. By September, the enemy had opened their trenches round Perpignan, and Pérignon was entrusted with a night sortie. On approaching the Spanish line, a fusillade of musketry swept down 500 of his little force, and his men at once halted and opened fire. But Pérignon believed in the bayonet. With stinging reproaches, he again got his men to advance, and sweeping over the enemy's entrenchments, he drove them in rout and captured their camp. He thus won his promotion as lieutenant general. In November of 1794, Dugommier, the French commander-in-chief, fell mortally wounded at the Battle of Montagne Noire, and Pérignon was at once appointed his successor. Though no great strategist or tactician, he was an able leader of men, and had the faculty of enforcing obedience to his orders. Trusting entirely to the bayonet, he forced the fortified lines of Escola, making his troops advance and charge over the entrenchments with shouldered arms, without firing a shot. The fortresses of Figueras and Rosas alone barred the advance of the French into Catalonia. So demoralized were the enemy that Figueras, with all its immense stores, 9,000 troops, and 200 pieces of artillery, capitulated to a mere summons. But Rosas stood firm, covered on the land side by the fort of Le Bouton on the top of a precipice, and on the sea side swept by the guns of the Spanish squadron anchored in the roads. The fort of Le Bouton was called L'Imprenable, but Pérignon was not frightened by names, although greatly hampered by the civil commissioners with the army and held by them as suspect. He determined to capture Le Bouton and Rosas. Le Bouton was dominated by a perpendicular rock 2,000 feet high. It was certain that if batteries could be established on this precipice, Le Bouton could be taken. But the artillerymen believed that it was impossible to construct a road to haul guns up to this height. "Very well, then, it is the impossible that I am going to do," replied the obstinate little general. And after immense toil, a zigzag road was constructed, and the guns hauled by hand to the summit. After a severe bombardment, Le Bouton was carried by an assault. But still Rosas held out. The weather was very severe, and the snow came above the soldiers' thighs, and the engineers declared that it was impossible to construct siege works unless a certain outlying redoubt was first taken. "Very well," said the general. "Make your preparations. Tomorrow I will take it at the head of my grenadiers." So at 5 o'clock the next morning, February 1st, 1795, the grenadiers, with their general at their head, marched out of camp, and under a murderous fire, by 8 o'clock captured the outlying redoubt. So after a siege of 61 days, Rosas was captured. It was the personality of their general which had taught the French soldiers to surmount all difficulties. Absolutely fearless himself, full of grim determination, he taught his soldiers how to acquire these virtues by example, not by precept, ever exposing himself to danger, showing absolute callousness, until his men were shamed into following his example. On one occasion during the siege, a shell fell at his feet, with the match still fizzling. He was at the moment directing some troops who were exposed to the fire. The men called out to him to get out of the way of the explosion and throw himself flat, but he paid no attention to the bomb and quietly went on giving his orders, for he knew how his example would steady his troops. Meanwhile, someone dashed up and extinguished the match before the bomb could explode. The Peace of Basel prevented Pérignon from gaining any further success in Spain, and the directors, out of compliment, appointed him ambassador to the court of Madrid, where his good sense and moderation did much to strengthen the peace between the two countries. In 1799, he was sent to command a division of the Army of Italy and commanded the left wing at the Battle of Novi. While attempting to cover the route, he was ridden over by the enemy's horse and taken prisoner with 8 honorable saber wounds on his arms and chest. When the Russian surgeon was going to attend to his wounds, thinking more of others than of himself, he said to him, "Do not worry about me. Look first after those brave men there, who are in a worse plight than I." After a few months, his exchange was effected, and he returned to France, severely shaken in health and not fit for further active service, to find Bonaparte first consul. Though not one of his own followers, Bonaparte recognized the services he had rendered to his country and arranged for his entry into the Senate, and in 1802 appointed him Commissioner Extraordinary to arrange the negotiation with Spain, a delicate compliment to Pérignon, who had made his name on Spanish soil. Further to recall his Spanish victories, in 1804 the emperor created him honorary marshal, not on the active list, and later gave him the title of count. But though Napoleon did not think that the marshal was physically fit to command again in the field, he entrusted him in 1801 with the government of Parma and Piacenza, and in 1808 sent him to Naples to command the French troops stationed in the kingdom of his brother-in-law, Murat. The task was a difficult one, for Murat was no easy person to get on with, and southern Italy, from the days of Hannibal, has been a hard place in which to maintain military virtues. But the marshal, with his sound common sense, gave satisfaction both to Napoleon and to King Joachim, and at the same time kept a tight hand over his troops. When, however, in 1814, Murat deserted the emperor, the old marshal withdrew in sorrow to France, to find Paris in the hands of the enemy. Like the other marshals, he accepted the Restoration and was created a peer of France. Being himself of noble birth, and an ex-officer of the old royal army, Louis XVIII, appointed him to investigate the claims and verify the services of the officers of the old army who had returned to France at the Restoration. When, in 1815, Napoleon returned from Elba, the marshal, who was at his country house near Toulouse, made every effort to organize resistance against him in the Midi. During the 100 days, he remained quietly at his home, and on the Second Restoration was rewarded with the command of the 1st Military Division and created Marquis and Commander of the Order of St. Louis. But he did not long enjoy his new honors, for he died in Paris on December 25, 1818, aged 64.
This concludes Chapter 24 of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Join us also for Chapter 25 about Jean Serrier. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. We'll get back to you next week. Thank you very much, and so long.